Art also in the news and in the Congress is the whole debate on cap and trade. And once again, I think we see Obama struggling to be progressive and in the middle. What do you think is going to happen on this?
Well, let me back up a little bit. I'd like to set the stage just a little bit for this, because we never actually discuss global warming when we talk about cap and trade and about what to do with it and about politics and everything. I want to back up and just say a thing or two about global warming, because it is a real threat, and we've got to look at cap and trade and all the rest in the context of that threat. According to the American Geophysical Union, if the temperature increase caused by global warming is more than 2 degrees, becomes more than 2 degrees C, that would be about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's going to, within a century or two at the most, melt all of Greenland, raising ocean levels by many meters, by about 20 feet, and that's just Greenland. I'm not sure what happens to the West Antarctic ice sheet in that case, but part of it's certainly going to melt also. Now that is a real threat. We're talking about changing long-term history. We're talking about changing the geological ages by what we do here in the next 10 years. We're very close to that 2-degree turning point now. We've already caused 0.75 Celsius degrees of warming over the last 50 years or so. There's another 0.5 degree Celsius built into the system when the system equilibrates, in other words, with just the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere now. That's going to raise, that is going to raise temperatures by another 0.5 degree just because of the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. So we've already got 1.25 of those Celsius degrees accomplished, or whatever you want to call it. It's not far till we get to that 2 degrees, and we will at about that point essentially guarantee that Greenland is eventually going to melt, because nature is going to take over at that point. Natural feedbacks are going to take over, having to do with the melting of the Arctic ice cap and having to do with melting of permafrost and other things. Feedbacks are going to kick in, and it's going to be impossible to stop this thing. This could happen within the next 10 years or so. We've got to approach cap and trade with that sense of urgency, seeing that that's going to happen. So the Congress has passed a not-so-bad cap and trade bill. It has 3 major parts to it. One has to do with renewable energy, the second has to do with efficiency, and the third has to do with global warming. Like I say, it's not so bad. The renewable energy part calls for industry, especially the energy industry, to furnish 20% of their energy through renewables by 2020. Now that's not so bad. There are other smaller percentages for sooner than that and larger percentages later than that, but that gives you a ballpark figure. Going to be some real increase in renewables there. On the global warming aspects, it calls for, by 2050, an 83% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions by the United States. Increase. But that bill did pass the House. There are other shorter term targets also. It passed the House barely because a whole lot of Democrats voted against it. It passed by 219 to 212. So it was a close thing. Yes. Vic Snyder happily voted for it. He was the one representative that voted for it. We should all applaud him. And against it, and that's in the Arkansas delegation. Yeah. Representative Bozeman and Ross and Berry are 2 Democratic representatives. Ross and Berry voted against that bill, and shame on them. So that's where that stands. I don't have much hope for it getting through the Senate, though. It's going to be a hard nut to crack.
Interesting is this seems like a good bill, but I think that what we need to be looking at this is sort of a major national, imperative, and I think we need to be diverting massive amounts of money. I think it needs to be looked at not just as an environmental issue, but an economic issue and an energy issue. They're all tied together. We could vastly stimulate our economy if we, instead of stimulating the war in the permanent military complex. I mean, we're spending $1 trillion a year on military and war if you include interest on past military spending. We should be cutting that in half and using that $500 billion a year to cover everyone's houses in solar panels.
Absolutely.
And I think there's even a proposal.
That's never mentioned in the debate.
I mean, we could do so much.
Well, that's part of the bill.
And
some of that is part of the bill.
Cutting the military.
But
is that a part of the bill?
No, that's not. I'm sorry.
But I'm just saying that's the kind of priority it should be. And you know, this massive military spending isn't really stimulating our economy. If we invested in clean energy infrastructure on a major level in the United States, it would provide millions of jobs. It would you know, stimulate our economy. And,
absolutely. This is part of the bill. There is a renewable energy section. There's an energy efficiency that covers those areas, but not as strongly as I'm sure we'd like.
I think it's, we
well,
need something
it sounds like you've given up on the Senate completely. Is there any hope?
Boy, it's going to be, I think it's going to be very difficult.
Watering down? What's
I'm afraid
going on?
it's going to be compromised further. It's already been compromised somewhat, but I'm afraid it's going to go further.
And how are our senators voting?
Right now, they seem to be leaning against it. I think Pryor's pretty definitely against it, and Lincoln is on the fence. One more thing about the economic side, which is very important. According to the Stern report of a few years ago, this is a British report, very renowned group of economists that made this report. It's going to cost us a little bit to do what we need to do to solve global warming. It's going to cost us something like 1% of the world gross domestic product over the next 50 years or something like that. But if we don't do something about it, if we pursue business as usual, you're talking, according to the Stern report, you're talking about something that's going to look like World War II for the next 50 years. You're talking about a huge negative impact.
20% decline in global GDP.
A 20% decline in global GDP versus a 1% cost if we do the right thing and solve it.
What's interesting,
it's huge difference.
That we need to be spending massive amounts stimulating the economy on clean energy infrastructure. I mean, to address the environmental situation as well as other things. But what's interesting is people are against stimulating the economy and against spending money, but we'll spend this massive amount on the military. It's the same kind of thing. I mean, it's a stimulus. The military spending is a stimulus, and that's a huge part of our economy is the military spending.
That's a good
creates
point.
Millions of jobs. It's just a matter of what are these jobs doing? I mean, or should we have all these people destroying things or creating things? You know, and I think that energy infrastructure would be more of a sustainable economic investment than building bombs.
Obviously, but how do you convince the Senate of that? You're not. That argument's not going to go very far in the Senate.
I don't have the answer, but it just reminds me that leading up to World War II, I believe this is true, Roosevelt was in position or talked the Congress into taking massive amounts of the economy and directing it to war production. Well, we are facing a war in terms of the climate change, not an imaginary war.
Exactly.
Not and we need to read.
It can be done.
Yeah, we did it. It could be done.
All the cars production was changed to tanks in just really less than a year.
No, I think we can do a whole lot, and we're sort of selling ourselves short when we don't think we can do it. And I think we're also facing a war in terms of the economy. And I would argue, you know, we have politicians scaring us and saying we need to be worried about terrorism and things like this, and that's a serious issue. But I would say that we face a far, far, far greater national security threat from our economic, in terms of our economic national security.
That's why this bill is called the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009. So this is in the minds of the people who
could be a Bush title too.
Yeah, right. Security.
I really think that's important to communicate to people, though, is that economic national security is a far, far bigger issue than potential, you know, national security issues.
But security for who? The corporations are only interested in their power and money right now.
But global warming is going to mean a lot of insecurity around the world. It's likely to lead to wars.
They don't think about the future. They don't think about themselves or anybody else in the future. What I wish could happen is we could have a truth. When somebody like Newt Gingrich comes out and makes a pronouncement about, oh, this is too expensive, we need to know how badly and how often they have been wrong. Why are we listening to these people?
No.